So the Congress, though, later overrode this and said, now, wait a minute. If you're going to take away every dollar people earn over $25,000, they're not going to produce all the war goods that we need. Like, we're in a war here. So it was mostly for that reason that they decided, not so much for the, hey, you're stealing from people, you probably shouldn't do that. It was the state can't carry out its ends as effectively if you do that. Well, whatever the reason is, at least they got rid of that. Well, one of the points that I've made a lot of times is that typically, and I'm following up on Ralph Raico, anytime you hear that a politician is beloved, you know this is bad news, right? You know this is bad news. It's like anytime I interviewed Tom DiLorenzo this afternoon for this sort of internet broadcast thing that I do, and we were talking about Lincoln. And here's an area, where Newt Gingrich and Hillary Clinton are just as enthusiastic about him as anybody. They both, and I said to him, you are getting to the heart of the regime when you have narrowed it down to things that they all love and wave incense before. That you're getting to the core of things. Well, likewise, Teddy Roosevelt is supposed to be the president we all love, because he's like a man's man, and he goes on safaris, and he's got teeth the size of my head. This is supposed to be great. But Teddy Roosevelt had this philosophy of the presidency that argued that there were two basic planks of it. One of them is that the president, the executive branch, can do whatever it is not prohibited from doing in the Constitution. So kind of turning the thing on its head. And then secondly, he says, I, the president, I am the only elected office. I occupy the only elected office that all Americans vote for. That, a senator, well, people from one state vote for the senator. But the president, all Americans vote for president. And so I am the unique representative of the American people, therefore. And so it's my responsibility to carry out the will of the people. Even if that means overriding the Congress, I have got to get the people's will done. And of course, every demagogue speaks that way in history. They've all spoken that way. I'm just carrying out the people's will. Don't look at me. I'm just doing what they want. And so, so there time after time, he would do crazy things. He threatens the coal miners and the coal owners, the owners of the mines, during the coal strike in 1902, and people are saying, because he was threatening to take over the mines, have the army take over the mines. People said, well, where does the Constitution authorize that? And he says, to hell with the Constitution when people want coal. And everybody thinks, yeah, there's a man of the people. And he was actually instructing his subordinates that you are on my notice to take over the coal mines, regardless of what you are told to the contrary by anybody else. And again, people are trying to make constitutional objections to him, and he says, look, the Constitution was made for the people, not the people for the Constitution. So every time something of significance comes up, he just invents some slogan, some demagogue-type slogan, and people just love it. They just go berserk for it. But one particular thing that was suited to TR, of course, is the executive order, right? Because that's a way the president can do what the people demand without having to listen to a bunch of crummy congressmen. So when you look in the 19th century, how many executive orders are these presidents issuing? I mean, I know we all oftentimes sit around and reflect on the administration of Chester A. Arthur. So we probably know offhand that he issued, no executive orders, or Benjamin Harrison issued 3 executive orders, But then you get to Teddy Roosevelt, and he issues over 1,000 of them. Because this is his philosophy of the presidency. That's who he is. So there's one example where he wants this treaty with the Dominican Republic to pass, but the Senate doesn't seem to like it. So he decides that instead of renegotiating the treaty, whatever, taking this under advisement, instead of that, he decides, let's just not call it a treaty. We'll just say it's an executive agreement, which is like a foreign policy analog to the executive order. It's just an agreement between me and the Dominican Republic, and that's what he did, and he just passed it. And I used to have students, and God love them for their innocence, but they used to say to me, is he allowed to do that? So, well, he did it, right? Isn't that the important thing? The guy did it. So before saying there's a little something about George W. Bush. I mean, we have George W. Bush in the title of the book. It's The Fate of American Liberty from World War I to George W. Bush. We did that basically because we thought by 2008 people are just going to be ready to commit atrocities every time they hear the name George W. Bush. So we have to make sure people know that he's targeted in here. But before we get to that, just a brief thing about one of my favorite presidents, and I say that sarcastically, Harry Truman. Now, Harry Truman, you should all listen to Ralph Raico's lecture on Harry Truman on Mises.org, or look it up on Lou Rockwell when he wrote it out, because it's absolutely excellent. But Harry Truman expressly held these same views. I mean, he came out and said, you know, I'm the unique representative of the American people. I can do anything I'm not prohibited from doing. He had exactly the same philosophy of the presidency. And Harry Truman is the guy we're all, as a president, we're basically taught to admire. He's one of the good guys. As a matter of fact, most of you are not old enough to remember the election of 1988. Good for you. But in the election of 1988, it was George Bush, the father, against Mike Dukakis, the Massachusetts governor. And the funny thing about that election was, each one of those two men, as they stumped around the country, each one of them was trying to see, they were both competing to see which one of them could be more like Harry Truman. They were both, you know, hey, look at me, I'm just like Truman because I'm doing this or that. No, I'm Truman. Truman had the lowest approval ratings ever of any president ever since they started polling on this matter when he left office. And that's what they're competing to be. Who can be the most hated guy? I mean, it's just amazing to me that you would want to appeal to this guy. Well, anyway, so Truman, during the Korean War, 1952, there's a threatened steel strike. So Truman just seizes the steel mills. We tell this story in the book. He just seizes the steel mills. And so, of course, the owners of the steel mills thought this was, uncalled for. And so, it just seemed like stealing to them, basically. So the thing wound up going to a lower court and a federal court. And a federal judge, in fact, wound up questioning the assistant attorney general. Now, probably you've not heard of the assistant attorney general under Harry Truman, Holmes Baldridge. But Holmes Baldridge was not really prepared for Judge Pine, who asked him, having heard what the assistant attorney general was saying about the powers of the president, he said, is it your view that the Constitution limits the power of the judiciary and the legislature, but not the executive? And his answer was that is how we read the Constitution. And by the way, that's how the Bush administration reads it. That's how John Yoo, who was in the Justice Department for several years, that's absolutely how he reads it. That Article 2 is just an expansive power that really authorizes just about anything the executive wants to do that's been traditionally held to be some kind of executive power. So then the judge said to the Assistant Attorney General, 1952, he said, do you mean to say to me that if the President authorized one of his subordinates to take you into custody and execute you in the morning, you would have no way to enjoin him from doing this? And the response came, I'll have to think that one over. All righty. Well, the Supreme Court did overturn the steel mill seizure, but actually very, very weakly. It's the Youngstown case is supposed to be this fantastic, wonderful decision. It's actually a very weak decision, and it actually seems that it was public opinion that was against the steel mill seizure that actually turned the tide. That otherwise they would have just gone along with it. Yeah, sure, the government can seize property because it's the government. But after that, of course, you've got Truman. He did this, by the way, because he says he's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. That authorizes him to take the steel mills. Figure that, do the math on that one. But of course, that means that his views on war powers are not difficult to discern. He says that because he's the commander-in-chief, he can send however many hundreds of thousands of Americans overseas to go fight in Korea without consulting anyone. He can do that because he's the commander-in-chief and because the United Nations authorized the war. So, why should he have to consult some mere congressman, when he's got the diplomats of the UN to back him up? And this now seems normal to people, that presidents do this a lot and whatever, and there's nothing unusual about it. But it was unusual until 1950. You do not see this being done in American history, regardless of the neoconservative claim that hundreds of cases of this can be found in American history. That is a huge lie. I talk about that in my 33 Questions book, and I think a little bit in here. That's just a total lie. There aren't. When you actually look at these alleged examples, it's like 5 soldiers chasing 3 Mexican cattle rustlers over the border. And they're counting that as a military intervention that Congress was not consulted about. Well, I think that's rather different from trying to, invade North Korea, which they did in part of they wanted to do it during part of that war. But nevertheless, that's Truman's view. Well, who stood up to him was Senator Robert Taft. It was an old right senator who said, this is not historically correct. There's no precedent for this. And who stood up and opposed Taft? It was the liberal historians of the day, defending Harry Truman, the Democrat. It was Henry Steele Commager and Arthur Schlesinger, Jr. Arthur Schlesinger's work, by the way, should never be read. It is an utter waste of time. Especially his work on Andrew Jackson, trying to make Andrew Jackson, who had his flaws. Look, I'm not a supporter of Andrew Jackson, but by and large, he did more or less believe in a free economy. Try to make Andrew Jackson out to be the forerunner of the New Deal. I'm not kidding. That was on my general exam as an undergrad when I was going for honors. You had to take a written exam, and one of the questions was, do you think there's a link between the 30s, Jacksonian democracy, and the New Deal of the 1930s? I said, as a matter of fact, I don't, and here are the reasons. And I actually did really well on that exam. So the evidence is staring you right in the face.